Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. We are continuing our theme of wisdom beyond words, and in particular looking at what we call the three lakshanas, which I'll say a little about in a bit. But the theme's called wisdom beyond words, and we kind of started off quite like, I think we had a few talks that were really evoking the sense of the kind of the mystery, the sort of wordlessness of what Buddhism calls wisdom. But that doesn't mean that wisdom is always really like out there, far out, really confusing and paradoxical. It does have that dimension to it. But wisdom is also beyond words because it has to be lived and experienced. It's something that we kind of translate into our lives as a lived, direct experience. And in that sense, it's always beyond words. It's not something words can kind of point towards that. But it can be very, very simple even. Like the truth, you might say, Buddhism would say, is in our face all the time. But we don't see it because we have these like deep down kind of resistances. Our sense of self, our sense of security can feel really threatened by the truth, which is what we call ignorance, this kind of ignorance, this sort of conscious or unconscious willful resistance to actually experience the truth, like of impermanence, for example. I read in Satyajyoti's talk about impermanence and how it's obvious, isn't it? Everything's changing all the time. It's so intellectually obvious, but for that to become wisdom, to be a kind of a wisdom beyond words, it's lived and experience, that's another thing. That's very difficult to do. And tonight's talk, tonight's lakshana, is particularly, you might say, visceral and in our face, and also is particularly, we probably particularly really don't want to look at it, and we really don't want to kind of think about this perhaps a lot of the time. It's about suffering. And I'm not going to be talking about the experience of suffering. I'm going to be talking about how reflecting on the nature of suffering, that can be a real gateway to wisdom, to liberation, and to be able to allow us to be able to help and benefit other people even more in a wise way that actually can really benefit people. But we've had these previous lakshanas. We've had impermanence with its positive counterpart. We can change. Everything's changing, flowing, arising, ceasing. And then we had last week anatman, lack of fixed, essential self. The positive being we're all interrelated, we're all interconnected. And this third lakshana, dukkha, which can be translated as suffering, but as you see it here, it's often translated as unsatisfactoriness, which I'm not even sure is a word in the dictionary, but it works, doesn't it? Unsatisfactoriness. Suffering is just one translation of dukkha. Unsatisfactoriness is another one. And it's kind of there's this, I think its literal meaning, the word dukkha comes from it's said to be like an ill-fitting cartwheel. So imagine that we all used to ride around on carts, or imagine we are riding around on a cart, not in a car, with its wheels, on these bumpy roads. And if the wheel doesn't fit, you're going to get jiggled around, jarred around. It's not going to be satisfying. And you may even sometimes get thrown into a ditch. It could be really horrible, actually, at times. But at the very least, it's going to be a bumpy ride. It's going to be a bit uncomfortable, a bit unpleasant, or at least not totally satisfying. And during this talk, I'm going to be sort of using the words dukkha, the word suffering, somewhat interchangeably, but they do have different connotations. I think this word dukkha, it has a more kind of existential reality to it, saying it's more like this ill-fitting cartwheel. It's like our situation. It's not just an experience of pain. Dukkha can mean more than that. It's like it's more about the sort of existential human situation. But I will also be using suffering because the English words can carry a real punch and a real weight. And I think when we hear suffering, it has an effect, doesn't it? Which dukkha might not. So I'm kind of going to be using both words, but don't take it too literally. Words are words. They're kind of playthings that we use to sort of point towards something. So I'm going to be using these words, but don't ever take it too literally. And just before I kind of launch into the sort of main bulk of the talk, I think it's helpful to just point out as well, just to recognise that dukkha is why we're here. So dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, is why we came to the Buddhist Centre. If there wasn't dukkha, there'd be no need for Buddhism, no need whatsoever. You may or not agree with that or not, but that's what I'm saying. It's what brought me to the Buddhist Centre. And it can be a whole variety of things. It's not just necessarily really strong, intense, what we would normally consider suffering, like a kind of big loss or sort of bereavement, whatever it might be. I came to the Buddhist Centre because I just did not know what I wanted to do with my life. I just felt unclear, wasn't clear. I felt like I needed clarity. So there's all kinds of different varieties of dukkha, but dukkha is what motivates us to practice. So the Buddha expresses this lakshana of dukkha, this mark of, you should say the lakshana means mark of conditioned existence, which is a little bit jargony, but you might say they're marks of the world, the life that we live, particularly the life and how we usually relate to it. Marks, things that are kind of sort of like stamps. It's not the whole of existence, but the existence is marked by these things. And the Buddha expresses this in the Dhammapada as follows. He says, all conditioned things are painful. When one sees this with insight, one becomes weary of suffering. This is the way to purity. So to say that again. All conditioned things are painful. When one sees this with insight, one becomes weary of suffering. This is the way to purity. So that might sound quite strong, and I think it's supposed to sound quite strong. That's one particular translation. You may read other translations that maybe aren't quite as visceral as that. But what's really important to say at this point is that this teaching and all the Buddhist teachings are, although they need to be taken seriously and playfully, but seriously, you should never take them too literally. And by that I mean we need to remember that there are always gateways, there are always invitations and methods, not fixed doctrines. There are ways that they're invitations to help us to reflect and to look deeper so we can experience the truth that's perhaps the words are pointing towards. So the Buddha isn't saying that all of life is suffering. And he's also not saying that somehow, that as if like all objects, all things out there in their essence are actually kind of miserable, painful, like just horrible a bit, or even just a bit naff, whatever really. It's like, he's not saying that things are kind of, like there's all this nice stuff, we enjoy things as happiness, but deep down in everything and inside you, there is just pain and suffering and nothing else. That is your core, that is your essence. This is not what the Buddha's saying. And he's not saying that all hope and beauty is just like a deluded fantasy, and that we should just give up on trying to, change the world or help people, because what's the point? It's all suffering. What's the point? That's grabbing the wrong end of the snake. You've heard this like analogy we've mentioned a few times now, I think. Some teachings, you can grab the wrong end of the snake and then you're bitten. And the particular wrong end of this snake is nihilism and thinking that things don't matter because it's all miserable and it's all suffering, which is not what this is saying. So this lakshana of dukkha, it's not so much about how things are in themselves in a sort of like ontological way, not how things are in themselves, but more about how we relate to them and how we experience them. It's more about the reality of the human lived situation. It's not a kind of metaphysical statement. And in this way, dukkha is somewhat different to the other lakshanas. The other lakshanas, you might say, have a bit more of a kind of objective dimension, like things are like this, in kind of, as it were, more objective way. As I said, this lakshana of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness or suffering, is something that we feel and live. It's about our lives and the lives of all living beings. So, we're going to be kind of looking at something now, looking into this a bit more, this kind of aspect of life that perhaps we'd often rather not touch with a barge pole, but we're going to do it. We're going to get those barge poles out. Good. So I'm going to talk about three kinds of suffering, three kinds of dukkha. I'm going to talk about happiness that comes from inside, which you may remember. dukkha, or pain, as an inescapable fact of life. And finally, the liberation and compassion that reflecting on this Lakshana can lead towards. So, yay, 3 sufferings, yay. So here we go. So this is a traditional list that the Buddha gave. It's kind of like a way of sort of discerning different these different kinds of suffering, because it's really important to do this, because we can recognize what we can change and what we can't change. So firstly, there is dukkha dukkha, which is great. Well, it's not great, actually, it's horrible, but it sounds great. It sounds kind of comical, but it's not. Dukkha dukkha, and this sometimes translated as the suffering that is suffering. And that's kind of its literal meaning. You can also just translate it as pain, I think, just pain. So this is physical pain, like bodily pain, illness, old age, hunger, thirst, even emotional pain, grief, loss, bereavement. It's all those forms of suffering that are kind of, we just can't help but feel, that they just will happen because we have a body, because we're alive. It's a painful experience. And then secondly, there's viparinama dukkha. Viparinama means something like changing. So this is the dukkha, the suffering of change. And this is because things end that we don't want to end. And things arise that we don't want to arise. So, the holiday, the relationships, things we enjoy, experiences, books, films, the pleasant day, the weather, it all changes. We've got things the way we want, and then it changes. Even our bodies, it grows old, it gets ill, and we die. Our state of mind even, we can't even rely on the sort of clarity we have now as we get older, for example. But also, things arise that we don't want. We get what we don't like. This is also contained in this. We get the rainy day, the people that we really don't like, who do really annoying, stupid things, they come and they do those things. And, viruses, there's all kinds of stuff. You could think of plenty of your own examples. But even when things kind of aren't changing and things are going well, we sort of know consciously and probably, unconsciously at least, we kind of feel that things will change. We kind of know there's this insecure situation that we can't rely to stay the same. So we experience anxiety and insecurity. So that's also included in this suffering of change. And then lastly, there's what's called sankhara dukkha, sometimes called the dukkha of conditioned existence itself. I've written here existential suffering. Existential suffering. And this is because no thing can ever actually totally satisfy us. So living in this world of things, we cannot but have this lack, this hole, this sense of being unfulfilled. And this goes for things out there, objects. Often we talk about, there's a new car and the new house, and you get there and it's not what you expected. Remember, last time I gave a talk, I talked about that perfect warm jacket, and I've got it, and it's not. I've not found perfect satisfaction from that, and thank you everyone who keeps asking me about it as well. I'm glad you care. But also, it's about situations, the perfect job, the ideal living situation, perfect partner, the ideal Buddhist practice. Or imagined states of being, if only I was more like this, if only I was less like that. All these things that we kind of crave after, that we want to satisfy us, but whenever we get them, they don't satisfy us deep down, because they all lack essential self-nature because of an Atman. We can't get hold of them. So even when everything's going really well, we can sometimes feel this form of dukkha, and sometimes even quite intensely. It may be experienced as anxiety, depression, so-called mental illnesses like these. And this suffering is real. That's kind of something I feel like I want to say. Probably so many people in the modern world experience this kind of existential form of suffering. And I'm not sure, probably increasingly so, but I'm not sure how much our society really recognizes this is actually suffering. This is real suffering, just as much as, the more physical, obvious suffering that people less fortunate experience, who live in like poorer countries, for example. It's all suffering. This is suffering as well. There's a particular, very briefly just mention a story of one of the Buddha's first disciples called Yasa, who is kind of like having this amazing party. I think all the guests are women, and they're like dancing, music and things, and they all fall asleep, and he wakes up in the middle of the night and sees all these women just like sprawled around, sleeping, snoring, drooling, farting, maybe, I don't know, I don't think it says that in the sutta, but like just being human, and this sort of like sees just like this thing that he thought was all glamorous, amazing, and just sees in an instant, this is not going to work. This, he says, this is horrible, this is terrible, and just bursts, storms out, and eventually finds the Buddha, and the Buddha invites him in and says, this is not terrible, this is not horrible. And the Buddha is there, you might say, he's inviting him to realize that it doesn't have to be like that. There is a happiness, and it's found from within. It's not found from having all the right stuff, or the right situation, or the right kind of state of whatever it might be. So not from possessing, consuming, achieving a particular goal, or having anything in particular, but by bringing about radical shift in our search for meaning and satisfaction, realizing that none of these things can really fully satisfy any of us. So practically, this is saying this is about living a thoroughly skillful life. So practicing the precepts, so more contentment, more grateful, more altruistic, cultivating a warm and expansive heart, of which inner happiness is a natural byproduct. So inner happiness, saying that happiness comes from within, is not saying that, I've been looking out there and I need to find this like thing inside me, and then I'll find that happiness and hold on to it. Like just finding this, it's like kind of, turning that craving inwards as if we're trying to find this happiness within ourselves. It's saying more that, happiness arises in dependence upon conditions, naturally, on the dependence upon the conditions of a skillful life. So it's like imagine like growing a flower. You provide the right conditions for the flower, the sun, the rain, the soil. The plant grows, and eventually from within, from its own essential nature, there blooms this amazing flower because all the right conditions were provided. The flower was given the right conditions for that to arise. So this is the positive counterpart of dukkha, which we talk about in the intro course. Happiness comes from within. However, I don't think this is quite the end of the story in our journey, our dukkha journey. So you may feel we've just reached a happy ending, you might say. We've found our inner happiness. Well, we've not yet, but we've at least found the potential for inner happiness, and can sort of now think, oh, good. We can safely move on now from all this talk about suffering. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say some more stuff, but I'm not really sorry, because it's actually, as I said, this is actually a terrain of liberation. We can, we'll see if that's how you experience it anyway. So the Buddha, if you remember, when I said that quote, he says, all conditioned things are painful. And I was quick to qualify this, and I think rightly so, because it's so easy to say that literally, as I said, and as if it's saying that all of life is suffering, and that the true nature of things is that they're all miserable, which is not what it's saying. But it is trying to make a point. The Buddha is really trying to make a point here. So it's true that through our actions, we can move towards a happier, more fulfilled life. But here's the question for reflection. Do I really think it's possible to reach a place or a state of being where there is no pain? So that's the question. Is it possible? Is there anywhere in the world, in existence, where there is no pain? So the Buddha sometimes speaks about escaping suffering, or going beyond, transcending suffering. But yeah, freedom from suffering is not the same thing as finding a place where there's no pain. Okay, transcending something is not the same as not experiencing it. So I was on the Mitra retreat recently, which is amazing, and I had a great time. It seems lots of people did. But I was chatting to a guy called Josh. He used to come here, and he's living in Cornwall at the moment, in Mitra there. And I don't know what we were talking about, but somehow we got onto the difference between different ways you can use the word freedom. And he pointed out that, oh yeah, it's like, you get your rice cakes, and it says free from gluten, and that means there is no gluten in there. No gluten, it's free from gluten. But the real freedom from gluten is being able to eat it. That's the real freedom, because you're not dominated by it anymore. You're not dictated by it anymore. Sorry if any gluten intolerant people feel a bit sensitive about that, but it's just like kind of example. The real freedom is not. So we might say the real freedom from suffering. It's freedom from pain, you might say. It's not being imprisoned by it, not being a slave to it, not being defined by it anymore. But it's not about not experiencing pain. Free from pain is not possible because dukkha is a mark of conditioned existence. So suffering, you might say, is a fact of life, but it's not the whole of life, but it's a mark of existence. My private preceptor who ordained me, Satchavaja, on a meditation retreat, we're doing different meditations on metta. One was on compassion. And I remember he said, when he was talking about compassion, he said, suffering is half of life. So you need to learn how to come into relationship with it positively. And that really struck me. And again, you can't take any of these things literally. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. But suffering is half of life. We need to learn how to come into relationship with it positively. So what the Buddha taught is that we can be free from the second and third levels of dukkha. So this suffering of change and existential suffering, which you might say is actually really is the real suffering. We don't realize that. We often just assume suffering is just painful experience and happiness is just pleasurable experience a lot of the time, I think. But we can become free, which is very significant from these levels of suffering, from the second and third. But the potential to suffer various pains, even intensely, will always be there. And the Buddha, towards the end of his life, he suffered and endured. Well, he experienced and endured intense back pain and sickness. Yet he experienced it mindfully, and it didn't affect his equanimity, and it didn't affect his liberation and his bliss. So Sangha, in his kind of early, youthful, highly idealistic days, wrote this in one of his papers. He says, if we think that following the path means nothing more than the studious avoidance of painful experiences, we are making a mistake of astronomical dimensions and plunging headlong down the path of a spiritual selfishness so utterly diabolical that it is frightful to contemplate even the idea of it. So he's making the point that sort of the skillful way to live and spiritual life is not about just trying to make pain go away, or even to make suffering go away, or even to push it away. It's a bit of a paradox because they say dukkha is what motivates us to practice, but we don't practice by trying to avoid dukkha. We actually need dukkha to practice. Actually, it's an essential ingredient. But the good news, though, there's a good news here, which is we can change how we relate to suffering. And this is crucial. We can change how we relate to it. And this can totally transform how we actually experience it as well. So we've all heard about the gap. And being in the gap when there are painful experiences allows us the possibility to not just respond with pushing away, pushing the suffering away, trying to make it all go away. Particularly if we can bring awareness and kindness to that at the same time, a kindly awareness. And if I'm really honest, I must say, actually, looking at my life, I think I've always found life challenging and difficult. It might not be everyone's experience, but even times in my youth where everything seemed to be going really well, I can look back at that and see that that was kind of all riding on this kind of hope that the next thing I was going to do was going to be the thing, like the job, the career. It was all there. All this amazing future was waiting for me. And that was kind of part of the condition that allowed me to feel like, oh, everything's amazing and it's all going to be amazing forever, which is a bit of a time bomb. And yeah, I'm afraid to say, I still find life difficult and I still find life challenging. That's still there. And so you might think, Prajnahirdaya, you're an order member, you've been practicing all this time, and you still find life difficult, you're still suffering. What have you sold us? What's going on? Why practice? Why practice? And it's really important. And I think partly myself, anyway, when I find, what's all this about then? It's like, it kind of challenges, I think, a particular modern myth of what happiness is. That happiness is just about having all the pleasure and none of the pain. Whereas in reality, meaning and fulfillment, a truly fulfilled life, does not arise from trying to live, from holding on to safety and comfort and trying to make everything soft and nice and just happy all the time and with no difficulty, if that's even possible. So it's as if we've got this, this bumpy chariot, this ill-fitting chariot wheel. It's as if rather than trying to fix the wheel or get a new chariot, or give it a new paint job or whatever it might be, we do something entirely new and creative. We can choose to actually get off the chariot. So this chariot, which is like this rolling along this road of happiness and suffering, and just from one to the next, want this, don't want that. We can choose to respond in an entirely new way, get off the chariot, find a new path of awareness and compassion, motivated more by values and less by just experience, you might say. More by beauty. And this is something incredibly positive and creative in potential. And I'm going to be finishing by just saying a bit about where this leads. So if we're reflecting on this lakshana of dukkha, really taking it to heart in the right way, I said not in a kind of nihilistic way, like everything's suffering, but really trying to see the sort of the nature of how suffering is or painful experience is kind of inherent in existence, to learn to really fully kind of penetrate that with insight. As the Buddha says, this kind of leads to becoming weary of suffering and following the way of purity. But it leads to what's traditionally said to be called the wishless liberation, A lot of these Pali words, they're often quite negative, in their language. It's like what it isn't, like wish less. But this is a state of liberation, and you might say it's a state of real, deep and profound letting go. Deep and profound, I might say existential relaxing, you might say. Perfect equanimity. So real freedom from suffering. So not free from suffering or free from pain, freedom from suffering and freedom from happiness as well, that kind of gimme. It's said to be nirvana, it's said to be the supreme bliss, but somewhat paradoxically, that bliss, it's not an experience in the way we usually think of experience. It's not just a pleasurable experience. This bliss is beyond experience, quite mysteriously somehow. And it's not cold and lifeless, so equanimity, this kind of perfect equanimity or wishless, it's not a cold and lifeless state. Sangha towards the end of his life, drew the significance of this out, saying actually it's the state of the spontaneously compassionate bodhisattva, the being who has reached the fulfillment of wisdom and compassion and lives for the sake of all beings. And the image of this, of the wishless liberation, it's said, the traditional image, it's like this perfect plane, perfectly flat plane, and then this perfect sphere on top of it, which is just with the slightest bit of push or inclination, is just prepared to go in any direction. So being perfectly equanimous to suffering, to experience, no longer being dictated by it, the bodhisattva is free to respond and to move in any direction, and has no particular preference which direction that might be, but it's always prepared to respond to the needs of living beings. So you might say it's one way to think of compassion, being completely free to be able to respond to whatever is needed, and to roll in whatever direction is needed. So the bodhisattva, has the wish to alleviate suffering, but without thinking they can fix suffering, if that makes sense. Without trying to fix it, not thinking that that any of us can make all the pain go away. That's impossible. And it can mean if we kind of acting on that basis, we can end up, I know I fall into this, seeing people just in terms of this, like trying to help people, but really I just want their suffering to go away, kind of relate to people as if they are just suffering, as if they're a problem. And it's certainly been my experience that, I've experienced this quite recently actually, that if I'm in a state of suffering, just having a friend there who is kind, who's just aware of me, just being there, just holding what's going on for me, that is what makes all the difference. And as soon as somebody starts to say, "Oh, have you tried this? Have you thought about that?" and I get this feeling I'm being seen as a problem now or something to fix. It's like, "Oh, they've gone. They're not there anymore. Where have you gone? You know, I'm here. Hello." You know, it's sort of, yeah, I experienced that quite really strongly recently, actually. That awareness and kindness, that compassionate holding, is such a gift that we can give to people without trying to fix them. But to enter this gateway of liberation, this wishless liberation, we need a warm, expansive heart full of metta, gratitude, positive emotion. This is what allows us to really see the truth and the significance of this without falling into a nihilistic state. And then perhaps we can begin, you might say, to forgive life even, forgive ourselves, forgive others for the suffering that we experience and that others experience. And yeah, perhaps through this process, we may realize that actually, through kind of embracing, through seeing the way that suffering is interwoven with life, strangely, we may find that it's far more beautiful than we'd actually imagined.